All right, welcome to our webinar, Cost-Effective IT for a Growing Business in 2021. This is presented by Brian Stoffel and Danielle Liao from Bluebonnet Technologies. So today we're going to discuss why IT is needed in a small to medium-sized business, common challenges in small to medium-sized business IT, comparison of the different solutions to try to achieve those IT goals, the emerging changes that are coming, that have come recently and are slated to come in the future, what implications COVID-19 has had on the IT environment, especially for small business, and then some questions and open discussion. So, why IT is needed in small to medium-sized business? Currently, approximately 92% of small businesses use one or more cloud-based solution. Just a few years ago, this wasn't the case. A lot of companies would get by with only using, Excel. And nowadays, the vast majority of companies are using much more um, complicated solutions, specifically those that are, software as a service and infrastructure as a service offerings like from Microsoft 365 or Amazon Web Services or any of those. And as you might imagine, keeping track with what all is required to be able to properly administer those is a full-time job in and of itself. So a lot of companies are seeing their need for a full-time IT solution um, existing much earlier than it used to. You could wait until you had 20 or 30 people before you needed to start thinking about some sort of ongoing IT support solution. Nowadays, that number is quite a bit smaller than that. Next, the average company today relies very heavily on IT, whether it's using Excel for standard spreadsheets or it's email communication. We'll get into it some more once we get to the COVID-19 parts, but with the emergence of remote work, all those things all require people to really lean a lot more into IT than they used to have to do. And it goes all the way down to every function of the job. Service companies will use Google Maps to try to find out what address they're supposed to go to, all the way through financial trading clearinghouses that do everything online and require high speed, low latency networks. Across the gamut, companies now rely heavily on IT. Because of that, there is an associated downtime cost. We're not in a position where if IT stops working or if your network stops working, your computer dies, that you can just shift over to paper. If you're an architect who's doing a CAD drawing for a skyscraper, you can't very well switch over to a post-it note and pen if your computer dies. And any of those types of outages have a direct associated cost with them, and those costs tend to snowball. So there's the cost of whatever money you didn't make while you were down. There's the cost of getting your system back up, whether that's hardware or labor or whatever. And then there's also, now you've spent twice as many man hours getting the same thing accomplished. So those costs can stack on top of each other pretty quickly. So because of that, we're also not in a position anymore where you can designate somebody in the office who happens to know a little bit about IT or who built their own gaming computer at home or what have you, and have them, take over the IT needs of your organization. Because those costs have gotten so big and because the reliance has gotten so strong, it's really, 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 really important now that those sorts of issues are resolved immediately and hopefully prevented from happening in the first place. But if they can be prevented, at least resolved quickly. One of the big challenges that a lot of small companies face now is they're put into exactly the position that I just said you don't want to be in, which is somebody is called to be the impromptu IT support, and that's not what their role is. If you have a law office and one of your junior attorneys is installing printers versus being able to bill out for hundreds of dollars an hour, it's not an effective use of their time. And from a business perspective, Um, Generally speaking, especially in small businesses where everybody wears so many hats and their productivity is so important, the ability to stick to what you're good at and let someone who's good at IT handle IT is something that's frequently overlooked, but is definitely necessary. One of the big differentiators between that professional IT person and somebody who's tasked to just do it on their free time, or because they happen to be the most tech savvy in the company, is keeping up with all the regulatory things that are coming down the pike. We'll get to some of the more specific things when we get to the emerging technology section in a second. But regulatory compliance requirements are changing so fast that it makes it really challenging to, for a layperson to be able to keep track of that. As of right now, we're seeing changes in PCI and HIPAA compliance that are being proposed, implemented, and then enforced inside of a quarter. And that level of change or that speed of change is something that's really hard to stay on top of if you're not, doing it professionally. And the last is liability. Um, it's pretty common to be able to, resolve an issue and band-aid something to make it work, but typically there's a higher skill set requirement to be able to do it in such a way that it stays working. So that's usually the reasons why you want to see professional IT versus amateur IT in a small to medium sized business. Common challenges in small to medium sized business IT. This is one of the oldest and best memes of all time, but I think oftentimes we see that it's very true. All right, so the common challenges in small business IT are several. First is obviously the cost. The total budget for IT is always something that's a point of contention for a lot of small business owners. Some of the times the issue is that, you know capital expenditure typically is prioritized towards things that are actually generating revenue, as opposed to things that are keeping the business running. Um, so we have a couple old schools of thought with this. One is it's better to pay for everything up front and do a large capex or capital expenditure, that buys all the equipment on the outset and everything is up and running the way it should be from the get go. The other is to do things more of an OPEX method, where you have an operational expenditure where you pay less, but you pay it monthly or quarterly in a subscription type basis. Most of the cloud services that exist out there, all the way now extending down to the operating system on computers, um, lean heavily towards the OPEX method. You'll see subscription-based services from Microsoft for 365. You'll see it for WebEx, like what we're using. You'll see it for the Microsoft Office suite, like Excel and Outlook, for Adobe. I mean, a lot of the real core business tools that people are using nowadays, you'll see that sort of monthly subscription-based model. And so the benefit to that is that your outlay at one time is never very high, but what it does is that it keeps you having a high monetary requirement to meet every month in order to keep those services up and running. Another issue that's happening more and more every day is usability and training. So as companies lean more heavily into their IT infrastructure and rely on it more, obviously the assumption is that the user capability and that the user comfort with IT is necessarily higher. Unfortunately, that's not that those types of things are typically much slower to evolve. Um, and in this case, the requirement is evolving much faster than the user base is. So we're starting to see more and more tickets where they are not failures of a specific piece of technology, but they're failures with training. So the company has added 5 additional methods of doing whatever, and the user is unaware of how to access those methods. They don't know how to enter in a URL for a website is a very common one, or how to create shortcuts to all their new cloud services, or how to manage password storage, or the things that we're starting to run into more and more. Um, Regulatory compliance we've already kind of covered. That can be a point of frustration for a lot of small companies. And then depending on what industry you're in, it can actually be an absolute requirement. So medical industries are going to be subject to HIPAA and high tech requirements, whose enforcement has actually changed the way it works now, and is going to start becoming a lot more prevalent. Um, Law offices are required to be able to communicate a lot of different aspects of their company via electronic means over email and everything else. Um, you have Sarbanes-Oxley for publicly traded companies. You've got Gosleach-Bailey for the financial sector. So there's a handful of different business sectors where if a small business is in that sector, even if it's a single person, there's a whole set of regulations that they have to follow that are mandated and enforced by law. Um, Obviously, if you're a Fortune 500 company and you have an entire compliance department, that's not that big of an issue. But if you're a three-person financial planning company, and you got to spend a ton of time going through and keeping up with those regulations, that can be a serious challenge. And what's interesting is that a lot of times the IT related ones are the ones that are evolving the fastest, which is also the ones that people know the least about to begin with. So they tend to be the most challenging of all of the regulations that are out there. Finding the right professional IT people. This is a challenge that happens all the time. If you are a plumber and you've been a plumber for 20 years, and someone came to you and said, "Hey, you know what? You're getting to the point now you should really hire a accountant." You're supposed to be able to go out and go find the best accountant and be able to vet whether or not they know what they're doing. Having never been an accountant, you probably have no idea what you're looking for. We see that happen a lot with IT people. We see companies that go out and they say, "Okay, we want to find a managed service provider, or we want to find an in-house person, or we want to contract with somebody for break fix stuff." And then they see that there's this plethora of companies out there, or people that are out there, and they try to figure out who is the best value, because it's obviously not always about the exact bottom line cost. It's also about what you're getting for that cost. And a lot of small businesses understand that, because they're very in touch with where their money is going to and what kind of value it's producing. But how to find that right company and what to look for is something that a lot of companies struggle with. Additionally, finding a solution that is in a budget that's acceptable, that has the appropriate skill set, that has some degree of accountability to your organization. So we're going to talk in a second about the different ways that this can be accomplished. But one of the common ones, or the common three, have very different ability and accountability and cost structures associated with them. Obviously you're going to have the most accountability for somebody who is in your office, and you can walk down the hall and go talk to them, hold them accountable for the work they're doing, fire them, whatever the case is. And then on the flip side of that, a break fix contracted person who's never in your office is probably going to have the least accountability. But knowing how those solutions work up front, with no background in it, is something that a lot of small businesses find challenging. And then last is risk and liability. So as a small business, you are responsible for what happens in your business, obviously. The issue that you run into as it relates to IT is that a lot of small businesses are reliant on IT 100%. They cannot function without it. Uh, the uh, uh, the um, the SBA has got multiple studies about the time between when a significant IT failure happens and when the average small business will close its doors forever and go out of business, and it's something around 6 to 10 days. So there's all of this risk in having an IT catastrophe occur, and then the liability falls entirely on that company. there is very little, if any, liability offset ever. If you're a small business, you rely on IT, and you have a server failure, you have malware, you have ransomware, whatever it is, that causes you to not be able to use your infrastructure. So, how do we figure out what solution works best for an individual company? More organizations than you might think use the keep calm and eeny, meeny, miny, mo method. But hopefully, we're gonna provide a little more insight into maybe some better ways to go about evaluating those different methods. So, like we said before, the three basic options are in-house, which is a full-time employee or employees department that handles all of your IT needs, that works just for your organization. They don't do any work for any other companies. They are truly in-house employees, just like anybody else. Break, fix, or contract. So this is kind of a gray area where sometimes you'll have contractors that are brought in for specific gear. Sometimes you'll have contractors that are brought in for the entire organization and just hired on an as-needed basis. And this is a common way that the really small companies will start, and we'll get to why that is in a minute. But it's not always the best solution. And then an MSP, or managed service provider, is a company of professional IT um, engineers who have been in the industry for a long time, typically, and act as your company's IT department. Now, as with anything else in life, there are pros and cons to all three of these. So let's get through talking about those. So in-house, some of the pros are significant for in-house IT setups. First off, there's immediate response time. Very few MSPs can keep up with, or anybody for that matter, can keep up with the kind of response time that you can get by walking down the hall and talking to somebody. So there's definitely a pro in that. High degree of familiarity. In-house IT people tend to have a decent amount of longevity, and typically they built whatever systems they're supporting, so they know it inside and out. There's no learning curve. There's no requirement to get, to pull settings or to find credentials. They typically will know those already because they set them up themselves. There's usually really good accountability for an in-house IT team. They usually will work for senior leadership. They usually have gone through significant amounts of employee training in that organization because of the level of access they have, and so that accountability is usually pretty good. Unlimited access. This is a little bit of a misnomer, but basically it means that that person or that team works for the organization only. So they don't ever have to worry about sharing with another organization. They don't have to worry about scheduling something in advance. They have 100% access to whatever those resources are. And then the last big pro is a great understanding of business needs. Typically, your in-house IT folks, especially the ones who have been in place for a while, will have an intimate understanding of what the business is trying to achieve with IT, what things they struggle with, what users require the most support, what users require the best performance. They typically will have a very nuanced and intimate understanding of what the needs for an organization are, and that can pay big dividends. That's a really good thing to have. Now, some of the cons. In-house IT support is almost always the most expensive. Um, in addition to the basics like salary for competent IT people, which nowadays is significant. The salary to be able to run a 10 to 15 person company, run their IT for a 10 to 15 person company, is gonna quickly hit $100,000 a year. And then as that company gets progressively more complex or has regulatory compliance issues that go along with it, then that number can go up from there pretty fast. Limited headcount. By virtue of the first con, if you're a 5-person IT company, it's going to be a little difficult to hire 4 or 5 people at $200,000 a year that are at the top in their field. That's usually going to be cost prohibitive. Normal employee issues. So one of the downsides to an in-house IT support structure is that they like to take time off, and they like to get married and go on vacations and have kids and get sick. and have arguments with each other, and all of the standard, and they usually require health insurance depending on what state you live in. So there's all the standard interpersonal conflict kind of issues. There's the standard, time off, like we just talked about. And then there's all the ancillary costs that go along with an employee that are beyond just their salary. And any small business owner can probably enumerate what all those costs are for you off the top of his head, because that's something that plagues every small business with, trying to bring on new employees. And in this case, not only do they have those issues, but like we talked about before, this is a position that's probably not going to directly generate revenue. Tunnel vision. This is one of the worst things about in-house IT departments. They don't know anything outside of what they work with on a day-to-day basis. So if you have Dell servers, in 2 years, your in-house IT support company or your in-house IT support structure is not going to have any familiarity with what's being offered by HP or Lenovo. If you have, if you have Cisco networking equipment, they are going to be completely unable to work on Sophos gear because it's changed a lot in the last 2 years, or whatever the case may be. You get this issue where the lack of they may have a lot of depth of knowledge in what they work on, but the breadth of knowledge that they gain by only having access to a finite amount of gear and a finite amount of technology and processes gets to a point where it makes it hard to know what industry standards are. It makes it hard to know what the rest of the industry is doing, because they've been working on the same gear the same way. It's been working for 5 years, and there's no point in changing it. It's that same kind of process inertia that can be one of the biggest killers of an in-house organization. And then the last is scalability. This doesn't happen all that often, but as we see a lot and it's happening more now, but there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions and divestitures that happen where company structures change, and they can potentially change a lot, and they can do it rapidly. So you may have an organization that's 50 people, and that requires 2 in-house, support people. And then that company is doing well, a competitor is doing poorly. The owner reaches out, writes a check, and all of a sudden now buys a 100-person competitor company. Your workload just doubled. You brought in a disparate network that, without fail, nothing is going to work with all of your stuff. And now you got to figure out a way to scale that support quickly to provide the same level of experience to your end users. That is a challenge that a lot of times will be a showstopper for most in-house IT organizations, barring the really big ones. Okay, so from that, break fix. So there are some significant pros to the break fix contract model. One is they're almost always the least expensive. If you can call up an IT company or a person and say, hey, we want to pay you $50 an hour. When something breaks, come in and help us out. Obviously, your recurring cost is very low, and then you only pay for what you need, and that's a lot of small companies will see that as a big pro. They typically can have a little more broad expertise area than your in-house group, simply because they probably have multiple other clients that have other technology setups that they're used to interacting with, and there's very much of a community benefit that happens by having a breadth of experience. No employee issues, because they're not a full-time employee. They're going to be a contractor or a contracted company. And then obviously the wider experience range, like we already talked about. Now, some of the big cons. Your organization as the customer and the contracted break fix person or company are, by definition, not going to interact very often. The interaction is going to be relegated only to when there is a problem, and there's typically very little change management or process control involved here, because you only call them when you need help. So if you decided to go install 5 new printers in another server, they probably weren't notified about it. And so you get to a point where there's a lot of rework being done because they're not kept in the loop on a regular basis. They're typically the least accountable, which can be important, especially when you get into regulatory compliance requirements. They typically will not you typically will not have a significant enough siloing of industry for a break fix contractor to really stay current on what they need to be doing. Um, Typically, these organizations are, or this solution is going to be a IT professional that works somewhere else who is moonlighting and doing break fix stuff, or it'll be a smaller IT support company who's doing something as maybe even as a favor. I mean, but it's going to be something that's relatively informal. And typically, what comes with that is it's not worth their time to go on the back end and spend hours and hours and hours becoming familiar with those regulations, training their staff, et cetera. And then again, it's usually not scalable. Um, if you're experiencing significant growth, or if your complexity increases significantly and especially rapidly, then this method is usually difficult to scale with, um, for a lot of the same reasons that the in-house structure is difficult to scale. MSPs. Full disclosure, Blue Bottle Technologies is a managed service provider, so but we're trying to be as objective here as possible. But there are definite pros that are seen study after study across the industry. First, if you have access to the most knowledge and experience that's accessible. So if you're a 10-person organization and you have a budget of, let's say, $100,000 a year for IT support, if you hire one person at $100,000 a year, you're limited to whatever expertise lives in that $100,000 a year person's head. If you spend that much or less with a managed service provider, then you have access to the entire scope of the managed service provider employee's experience. So that will be tens or dozens or even hundreds of people. We will typically have very high level partnerships with vendors, and be able to bring a lot more horsepower to bear for than you could get comparatively with an in-house solution. MSPs by definition are very scalable. That typically can scale hundreds or thousands of users in a given 1 week time frame. That's a very standard use case for MSP. High degree of currency. MSPs will typically either subdivide into departments that manage certain industries, or the entire MSP will manage certain industries, and you will find a very high degree of currency in those specific industries. Usually higher, or it's not uncommon to find that engineers in MSP that concentrate on medical or financial or legal are aware of those regulations down to the very lowest tech level, more so than compliance officers in companies who do that job. That's not uncommon at all. No employee issues, we talked about before. Most MSPs will not reach out to their customers and claim to be sick on a given day. So you don't have to deal with the day-to-day employee problems. They are not mutually exclusive with any other solution. So it's not a rare situation at all to have a small in-house company or small in-house structure, and then supplement those with an MSP that either acts as a lot of additional hands, if the in-house doesn't have enough time, acts as an escalation point if the in-house needs some backup from a experience or expertise perspective. We can subdivide responsibilities entirely, where the MSP handles networking and servers, and the in-house person handles the internal customer facing stuff like desktops and printers. I mean, all of those scenarios are common for MSPs, but the important part is they're not mutually exclusive with any other setup. We'll almost always have better tools and access to the very tip of the industry as far as what's available. And then there's one of the biggest ones is there's a indemnification of liability from the customer's perspective. What that means is, if a customer has an in-house IT person and they go and they create a problem that destroys a server, the customer now has to pay the salary for that IT person who destroyed the server. They had to pay for it to be destroyed. They have to pay for it to be fixed. They have to buy the new server, and then they have to eat the cost of the entire time that this whole situation happened. In the case of MSP, all the vast majority of MSPs will carry liability insurance that will cover those types of situations. So, luckily with the number of people and experience, um, issues happen very, very, very seldomly. But if they do, then there are protections in place so that the customer is made whole again, and they, other than inconvenience, see little to no negative impact to their organization at all. Sometimes that by itself is a differentiator, which is significant. Now, like I said before, in an effort to be objective, there are definite cons. MSPs, especially good ones, will always be more expensive than the break fix contracted type organizations. The good ones will often be more expensive than other MSPs. There is a definite stratification of skill set that exists in MSPs, and if you're around them long enough, you can start to see that pretty clearly. However, they're typically less expensive than the in-house setup, so they kind of occupy the middle ground. From the outset, an MSP may not fully understand what the business is trying to achieve. Now, typically, if it's in the same silo as far as the same type of industry, most medical organizations are trying to achieve the same things as most other medical organizations, and they have a similar need, a similar use case, and a similar needs analysis are going to look close. The same thing is true for one law office to another, one financial company to another. They'll be similar. So MSPs can usually onboard quickly, but from the outset, they will not sometimes have as much awareness of what that need is as, say, an in-house person would. They're usually not officed in your office, so the ability to walk down the hall and talk about something with an MSP is usually not there. Now there are some things that can be done to make it as close to that as possible, but the ability to turn your chair around and walk up to the person's desk is usually restricted with an MSP. And then obviously there's less accountability than in-house. There are specific systems in place that increase accountability for MSPs, um, but you can't ever have the same level of accountability as you can for someone who is on your payroll, and that's just reality. So those are kind of the three basic types of ways that we can try to solve the IT support issue. Now that being said, like I said before, the changes that are coming fast, and they're big ones. Just a few examples. So Rule 21A has been on the books for a few years. It's related to legal IT, and I think, don't hold me to this, but I think it was codified in like 2013. And what it basically said was that if you're an attorney who had a bar certification number and you were interacting with a courthouse or with another attorney, that you could actually perform process servicing via email, which was a big one. When that happened, there was a big bloom in legal IT requirements and legal IT contracts and interactions, because all of a sudden, if your email went down, you could potentially have been served an important document that you never knew about, but that you were still accountable for, which is obviously a significant paradigm shift for the legal community. Well, as of December 2020, there have been two subchapter additions to that law that took effect, and now that same process service can be accomplished via any electronic means that have a reasonable likelihood of being delivered. And in the summary of these rule changes, they specifically reference social media. So we've gotten to the point now where one attorney could send a Instagram DM to another attorney, and it could be legally binding, um, which is um, which is another big paradigm shift. Now, instead of just email, now attorneys are going to require totally reliable IT solutions from their cell phone in their bedroom all the way to their servers in their office. And it's going to be required by law. So that's an example of one of the big legal changes that's happened recently. HIPAA is the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act that covers medical organizations. They made several big changes. There's actually several hundred changes that have been made in the last 6 months. One of the big ones that happened. So there's an infographic on the page here from the HIPAA Journal in 2019 and this was a proposed change that ended up actually taking effect in 2020. and there have been a big change to the way that the enforcement is going to work. So now, previously there was kind of a general understanding that hits were between $5,000 and $25,000 a piece, and that if you were found delinquent for something, then you kind of got a slap on the wrist, and then they would tell you, hey, we're going to come back in 6 months, try to have this resolved. Well, so many companies were taking advantage of that they have changed the enforcement tiers now, or they have changed the enforcement method to now include tiers. And we'll skip all the small print, but one of them, tier 4, is willful neglect of HIPAA rules and no effort made to correct the violation within 30 days of discovery. So if they come in June, they find out that you knew about an issue in January and you hadn't fixed it by February, they can fine you retroactively no less than $50,000 per infraction, with a maximum of $1.5 million a year. So now whenever you catch me, I'll wait 6 months and then try to fix it method is going to become a lot more expensive. Now, this obviously is going to significantly increase the need for medical IT, because now there's teeth in whether or not you know HIPAA, and there's teeth in whether or not you've made an effort to resolve whatever those delinquencies are, and so that's going to require a lot of IT interaction. So I think we're going to see a lot of the bigger hospital systems are already doing a lot of this stuff, and I think we're going to see a lot more um, involvement between smaller IT organizations and smaller medical organizations, because there is no organizational size that goes along with these enforcement tiers. So for a tier 4 violation, it doesn't matter if you are a 10-person minor surgery clinic or if you're a 10,000 person hospital system. They don't draw a distinction, which means that you could see a lot of the smaller clinics going out of business if they don't take heed of this, which is probably a good thing. And then the last is PCI DSS v4 transition. So this is everybody's favorite, PCI compliance. It's how your credit card information is protected and handled while it's in transit and being used. And for the past several years, version 3 has been what governed all this. So version 4 has gone through all of the requests for comment processes and all of the necessary uh, jumping obstacles that it has to go through in order to get mainstreamed. And now it's going to be officially rolled out, and it's going to start being enforced in Q1 to Q2 of 2023. Now, to put a finer note on why the pace and the severity of changes is so crazy, if you look underneath on the infographic about the PCI DSS v4 transition, right underneath the transition period from v3 to v4, you'll see implementation of future dated new requirements. So as they're transitioning between v3 and the current requirements for v4, there are also going to be implementations expected of the next set of requirements after the set of requirements that aren't even implemented yet. So a lot of these larger regulations are really accelerating at a pretty incredible rate. Okay, last, COVID-19 implications. So this has been a big one in the last year. Obviously, everybody's had their own experiences with COVID and what what impact that's had on your job and your health and if you have small kids that weren't in school, maybe your sanity. But as far as IT goes, there have been huge impacts or implications from COVID-19. One is there has been something like a triple digit percentage additional load on cloud services as a whole. One of the ways that we're seeing this impact users is services like Microsoft 365 are being absolutely slammed, despite how large they are as a company and as an infrastructure. They build out their infrastructure growth and performance based on a predicted rate of increase of load requirement. All those numbers were completely nullified when COVID hit last February or March, and they were all of a sudden inundated with all these people that used to be working from their office now had to work remote, but still had to have access to the same features that used to be held inside their own network. So what they've done to deal with it is they've implemented throttling policies. They've implemented restrictions on how many files you can move at once, how many users you can add. Um, some of the core functionality of their Exchange systems and their OneDrive systems and SharePoint have all been put in place to restrict the amount of load each individual user can put on the system, thereby increase the number of users that they can service at the same time. For the most part, they've done a pretty good job, but if you interact with 365 as much as we do, it is a noticeable difference, and the extra work required to deal with it is noticeable as well. You also saw nationwide an increase in internet connectivity latency, and a decrease in realized speeds. So, internet connection circuits leverage a marketing method called oversubscription. So if you and 10 of your neighbors all buy a 50 meg by 20 meg circuit, you will all be served by a single 100 by 50 meg circuit, because the assumption is that I'm not downloading something at the exact same time Danielle is. And so if I download from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. and she downloads from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., then we both can use the same circuit without stepping on each other. We both see the same speed, but the service provider can get away with providing less actual capacity. That's not true anymore. Now everybody is using the internet so much more, and at so many of the same times, that there had to be a significant increase in capacity planning from the ISPs. Now, just like with cloud services, they couldn't do this as quickly as they needed to. So nationwide, we saw latency increases and we saw throughput decreases, which obviously is going to affect anybody who's. It's going to make your WebEx video choppier. It's going to increase how long it takes you to download an important file or add static to a VoIP call. It's just those weird kind of gremlins that exist in your day-to-day, environment that was caused by all this extra load. Equipment performance requirement. So, 2 years ago, if you had a laptop that could sit on your company network and could open Excel, most people were good. If they could get email and they could open Excel, that's really all they needed. Now, they have to be able to open email, open Excel, run a second monitor, make voice calls, have HD video. They have to be able to stream stuff in real time because they're having to push information back and forth to the cloud services. Just the requirement for an individual's computing environment has gone up astronomically. And so all of the associated backend has also gone up as well, to match that. So you're going to see kind of a common theme here of capacity that exists from a computational and bandwidth perspective, exists all the way through the end user. The rapidly changing regulations and requirements. So as COVID came out and we started using a lot of these other technologies, you see a lot of the regulations and requirements changing, specifically from a security perspective. This is when a lot of the new HIPAA regulations were proposed and implemented. This is what kicked off a lot of the PCI DSS v4 transition stuff. This is when you see briefs from the State Department talking about Zoom calls, what their country of origin is, what their security is, what kind of information you should be sharing on those. The security posture of the entire country, most every end user, and all of your common day-to-day applications have all had to be evaluated significantly and changed significantly, all in a 12-month time span. Because right now we're coming up on 12 months from when COVID really started taking hold, and we've seen 4 or 5 or 6 years of procedural change in the IT industry. And then the bane of every IT administrator's existence, the BYOD in disparate environments has gone up significantly. So used to, BYOD is bring your own device. Used to, the executives could bring their cell phone into the network, but nobody else could. Administrators were able to keep a very close eye on what devices could touch their network, could access their information. Now that is not true. And the administrators also used to have a lot of control over, what their environment was like. Well, now everybody who works from home, their environment includes an iPad, a refrigerator, a PlayStation, a CPAP machine that's on Bluetooth. I mean, it could be anything. The devices that exist in corporate environments now have had the environment has necessarily had to extend so far that administrators have had an accompanying loss of control, and have had to deal with it, and have done a pretty good job for the most part. But the bring your own device issues and the disparate environments on the far end have caused significant challenges for those administrators. And then the last is the requirement on IT infrastructure has gotten even more severe in the last year. Used to there were certain downtime allowances or things you could change in real time. Now most of that's gone. Now any IT environment that is deemed critical to the parent organization has got significant change management requirements. You have to be able to prove what you're doing is not going to break anything, that it actually is necessary, that it's not better to just leave it alone. Typically, you'll have a requirement for a dev environment or a development environment where you have to go make that change in a mirror of your current environment that is not the one that the average user is using, and prove what you said is going to happen is actually what's going to happen. Both of those types of procedural overhead have added a lot of workload to the average IT department or MSP or whatever the solution provider is. And all of that has changed significantly since the start of COVID-19. So I think we are right at an hour, plus or minus a couple of minutes. So at this point, we're going to open up for questions or any kind of discussion. If you're seeing this right now, you probably have Danielle's contact information, but if you're watching this on YouTube or seeing it later, then we have her contact information on the screen. So are there any questions that anyone's asked yet, Danielle, or anything you want to cover?
No, not any questions. I'm trying to think of some common questions that usually people have. Typically, I think whenever I'm talking to small businesses and they have like the break fix model or say like an in-house IT person, really it's just a contract IT person that comes in and out, right? Like their friend or someone that's coming in to fix something, and they're having concerns on switching over to an MSP maybe because they don't really have a lot of information on it. But what advice do you have for small businesses that maybe feel like they're not big enough to get an MSP and they have fear surrounding that to switch over to an MSP, and I guess expand on the scalability of what we can do or what an MSP can do essentially for them, so that they're not fearful thinking, oh, I'm too small, I can't move into, I don't need that kind of support yet?
Yeah, so I'd say two things. There's one of the biggest challenges in making any kind of move like that is what I like to call the growing pains, right? One of the ways that a company can prevent that is really concentrate on their documentation. If they are currently working with somebody, say, hey, let's generate some documentation about how our environment is set up and how it's working. So that way, if they do get bigger, if they go to an MSP, if they hire somebody in-house that's full-time, whatever they do, the better the documentation is, the easier the transition is. And the easier the transition is, the better the experience is overall. So that is a tip to make things easier. Now, as far as apprehension about trying to go to an MSP or go to a more formalized and scalable support structure, I'd say try it. Reach out to an MSP, see if they're interested, see if you can if you can have them in for a consultation to tell you what your network looks like, what opportunity you have to make it better or to meet your regulatory compliance, and have them put together a quote for you and see if it fits in your budget. You know, a lot of times people are intimidated by what they think it's going to be. You know, everyone always heard
Hmm.
these horror stories of consultants charging thousands of dollars an hour, and you know, only the top 100 companies in the country could afford these people and all this stuff. That's just not true anymore.
Right.
A lot of times it can be really really affordable, a lot more so than a lot of people think. In worst case scenario, someone gives you a quote and a couple pieces of advice on things you can make better, and then you move on down the road.
Right. Right. Last question. I think so for someone looking to transition, what does that beginning phase look like as an MSP coming in to kind of determine, what their current structure they have in place for IT, or what does that beginning phase look like so businesses know what to expect um up front?
So normally that's going to be a discovery session where the service provider is going to come in and say, okay, what does your current environment look like? They're going to do some electronic discovery. They might do physical discovery where they walk around and look at how things are interconnected.
Hmm.
Sorry, I had to take a cough break. The pollen's killing me. Um, so they would look at those things. They would also ask the users, what issues have you had that have been ongoing? What are some common tickets that you've had to put in, or what are some common problems that you've experienced? Because what they're looking to do is they're looking to get a holistic picture of the environment, and um, and then they'll suggest some things that they may have requirements for things that need to be changed before they start managing the network. And then, but usually it'll just be, we now understand what you're dealing with. Here's the first 20 items we're going to try to address, and should make a kind of lay out a plan for how to handle that. Keep in mind the goal of an MSP or any IT provider in general is not to make the life of the customer harder or have more work associated. The goal is to steal the old Apple motto, to make it just work.
Hmm.
So in a well-run environment by a competent IT service provider, whether that's an individual or an MSP or whatever, the net effect will be that the senior leadership will not know anything that's going on, right?
Right.
Everything should run so smoothly and should be so relatively error free that it should be an out of sight, out of mind type of relationship. That's the goal for any IT provider.
Right. Right. Okay.
So definitely
Well,
don't be scared off by the first couple of steps, because it should get a lot easier.
yeah, definitely, definitely. One last question. So, if someone's looking to transition to an MSP, what questions do you feel are most important when they're trying to vet out a provider?
Yeah, so definitely look for references. Um, definitely, preferably in your industry. Um, and don't be afraid to test people. If you have an engineer that comes by and says, "Hey, you know what? We're the best IT provider, since Bill Gates, and we can do anything and everything under the sun," and you've been having a printer issue, say, "Okay, well, I'm having this problem. Can you figure out what's wrong with it, or show me how to go address this issue that I've been having, or tell me some common things that you see in my environment that might be opportunities to make things better." And make them give you answers about your environment, because a lot of times the level of expertise that it's going to require to be able to handle that um, should be able to pass that test.
Right, I agree. I think those are all the questions for me, unless someone else has any questions they want to ask before we end the WebEx.
All right. Well, unless somebody is struggling with the unmute button, then I think we will call it good. I appreciate everybody's time, and hopefully we will see you on the next one.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your help, Danielle.
Yeah, no
Thank
problem.
you.